For more than 2 years now, Sudan has been gripped by a horrible, bloody war. By many metrics, the war has created the world's largest humanitarian crisis. It's difficult to even say, but some estimates point towards a death toll of up to 150,000 people. The UN estimates that up to 13 million people have been displaced, either internally or externally, because of the war. And despite the gravity of the situation, the war is still described, to this day, as a forgotten war, or a silent war, even though the Sudanese have been very vocal about it since day one. Outside of Sudanese circles, it's very clear that there's still a lack of discussions, of engagement, and of understanding about the war and about Sudan in general. I get a sense that there's a number of reasons why this is. For the most part, I feel like people still don't feel confident about the facts. They don't know how to situate the current war within Sudan's history or within the context of the wider region. So what I want to do in this video is not talk about the war itself, but talk about a very important aspect of Sudan's story that is still very much so playing out to this day. That is the Sudanese Revolution. The Sudanese Revolution, which started in December 2018, is such a rare example of a mass movement that didn't just seek to replace who was in charge, but to radically alter the way power is distributed across the country. The Sudanese revolutionaries did not simply want to seize power, but to transform it. And perhaps unique amongst contemporary revolutions, the Sudanese revolutionaries did not wait for the authorities to collapse to begin implementing their revolutionary ideals. They did so through novel forms of organizing and in collective writing. Here I'm referring to the neighborhood resistance committees and in the revolutionary charters which they wrote. These two are such powerful, inspirational expressions of the Sudanese revolution that I think are just so sorely overlooked. This video is for anyone who wants to learn more about Sudan. It is also for activists and organizers around the world to take heed. For leftists who are still reading about the Paris Commune, you don't need to look back 150 years to find a powerful, inspirational form of organizing and resistance. You need just to look at what's been happening in Sudan. So first I'll start with a simplified but hopefully useful timeline of the revolution, before then going more in depth about the resistance committees and the revolutionary charters. But before I do that, a cheeky little promo. This video is created within the From the Periphery Media Collective. Although we do a lot, we actually don't have any core funding, and so a lot of the work we do is on a voluntary basis. If you like this video, check out our Patreon and see all the other projects that we do, including podcasts where we talk a lot about Sudan. While you're there, consider becoming a member for as little as $5 a month. You not only help me make more videos like this, but you also support all the other really important work we do in From the Periphery Media Collective. But with that said, let's start. The revolution in Sudan, known as the December Revolution, started on December 19, 2018. It initially began as a protest movement against economic conditions, high unemployment, rising inflation, and increases in the price of bread. The leader at the time, Omar al-Bashir, had ruled the country for 30 years and had been seeking another term as president, a completely unconstitutional move that many saw as a power grab, as an attempt to remain in power indefinitely. His rule over Sudan was corrupt and brutal, marked by harsh oppression and internal aggression. The most clear example of this is the genocide in Darfur, which he oversaw starting in 2003.
The International Criminal Court has filed genocide charges against the president of Sudan. The court accuses Omar al-Bashir of masterminding attempts to wipe out African tribes in Darfur with a campaign of murder, rape, and deportation.
We are charging al-Bashir with three counts of genocide, 5 of crime against humanity, and 2 of war crimes.
Sunday, the country's information minister said that Sudan does not recognize the International Criminal Court and refuses to obey any decision or order it issues. An estimated 300,000 people have died in Darfur since conflict erupted. In 2003, local tribes took up arms against al-Bashir's Arab-dominated government in the capital, Khartoum, accusing authorities of years of neglect. Prosecutors say 2.5 million more people could die after being forced from their homes.
But back to the revolution. The protests quickly moved from economic grievances to a demand for the overthrow of Bashir himself, for the overthrow of the regime. One of the most powerful slogans of this period that concisely sums up the demands of these protests of the revolution was "Tasqut bas," just fall. To achieve these aims, revolutionaries employed several tactics, mostly revolving non-violent civil disobedience, mass protests, roadblocks, sit-ins, labor strikes, and the like. All of this comes into the context of what is to be known as the second wave of the Arab Spring. I was personally never a fan of the term Arab Spring, so I definitely wasn't a fan of its reincarnation with the second wave. But it is true that between 2018 and 2020, the Swana region saw several revolutionary protest movements spring to action in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Algeria, and in Sudan. One of the most important and notable organizations that formed in this period in opposition to al-Bashir was the Forces of Freedom and Change. This was a big tent organization, a coalition that included many different parties and forces, such as labor unions, civil society organizations, and resistance factions. The FFC was responsible for calling protests, for making demands. They were really the face of the revolution, especially in those early days. So day by day, there was increased pressure from basically every sector of society against Bashir and his regime. Protests continued regularly across the country, and on a daily basis, protesters were shot and killed on the street. But the regime was not able to quell the movement. And so, on April the 11th, Omar al-Bashir was overthrown in a coup conducted by 2 men, the Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the head of the RSF militia, Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, also known as Hemeti. Here I have to take a little bit of a break from the chronology, because as confusing as it may sound, these are the 2 men that are the center of the war that is going on today in Sudan. Before overthrowing al-Bashir, al-Burhan was a lieutenant general in the Sudanese army, also known as SAF. His story is basically one of riding the military ladder, first through the military academy, and then through increasingly high positions in the Sudanese army. Earlier in his career, he was positioned in the Darfur and in South Sudan, 2 places where gross atrocities were enacted by the Sudanese army. Up until he overthrew him, al-Burhan was seen as a loyalist to al-Bashir and the regime. Hemeti, on the other hand, has an altogether much stranger and much more terrifying story. Very little is known about his early years, where he is born, even the year he's born. But what's known is that his rise to power came when he became the head of the Janjaweed, the notorious militia that was used by al-Bashir to commit genocide in the Darfur. In return, the Janjaweed were allowed to reap the spoils of their conquest. In practical terms, that means that they had the ability to exploit and do as they wish with the raw resources from these areas. Most importantly, minerals from mines such as gold and copper and the like. Valuable minerals with which they can sell to regional and international companies. Hemeti's militia became such a valuable asset for Bashir and such a potential threat that he incorporated them into the state and gave them an official sounding name, the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF. So back to the chronology. These are the two men who orchestrated the coup to overthrow al-Bashir on April 11, 2019. They then created a transitional military council with al-Burhan as the head and Hemeti as his deputy, second in command. The idea, as they claim, was to keep things stable until such a time where they can transfer power to a civilian-led government and elections can be held. Now, while people in Sudan were overjoyed by the overthrow of al-Bashir, many people were incredibly dubious of this essentially new military junta. Not only had the Sudanese seen this many years ago in 1989, which was a military coup that saw al-Bashir come to power to begin with, but they'd also seen this 5 years earlier in Egypt, with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who took over in 2014 through a military coup, and up until today, but back then, it was very clear he didn't want to give up any power either. And so, for 1,001 reasons, the Sudanese protesters and revolutionaries did not trust the military. Some organizers, notably the FFC, entered into negotiation with the Transitional Military Council, while protesters on the street continued and started escalating their protests and sit-ins and civil disobedience. The protesters, for their part, were demanding the dissolution of the TMC, of the Transitional Military Council, and an immediate transfer of power to a civilian transitional government. One of the biggest expressions of this escalation was the sit-ins that were happening across the country, and one in specific in the capital city in Khartoum, in front of the military headquarters. This sit-in, which lasted between 2 to 3 months, was a kind of expression of a liberated area. It was a place where people stayed and slept. There were community kitchens. There were places to charge your phone. People would pray together during Friday prayers. It was really like, as we've seen in other places, a tent city. People sat and stayed and did not leave the square. Doing this all in front of the military headquarters sent a very clear message. We want you to fall. We want a civilian government. But at dawn on June the 3rd, 2019, with the sit-in surrounded, the RSF committed a heinous massacre, killing over 100 people, throwing 60 bodies into the Nile, and committing one of the grossest mass acts of sexual atrocities. All of this happened in front of the military headquarters, with the doors remained closed, refusing to allow protesters to seek shelter and safety from the RSF. This was a crime committed by RSF under the auspices of SAF. The internet was also cut, making internal and external calls basically impossible. And so it was very difficult for people on the ground to share footage of what was happening in the moment. Following the massacre, the military junta rescinded all of its negotiations with the FFC and other civil society organizations. But revolutionaries across the country were not going to be deterred. They continued their civil disobedience through protests and through street blockades. And a week after the June 3rd massacre, a major labor strike was announced that essentially brought the entire country's economy to a standstill. This wasn't the first labor strike, but it was certainly the largest. Workers and businesses across the country refused to work. The airport was all but shut. The seaports were all but shut. The banks were closed. This was genuinely a very large nationwide labor strike. And after 3 days of this, the military junta caved. They released political prisoners and re-entered negotiations with civil society organizations. However, despite these negotiations, the protests did not stop. Many revolutionaries and protesters who were initially dubious about the military were doubly convinced following the heinous massacre in Khartoum and saw the military junta as not something to negotiate with, but something to overthrow in itself. This cycle continued for a while, with civil society organizations negotiating with the junta and protesters continuing to protest while being gunned down by that self-same junta. A few months later, on August 20, 2019, the product of these negotiations were announced: the creation of a joint military and civilian-led transitional entity called the Sovereignty Council. This council would serve as a transitional government until such a time that elections can be held and then there be a transference of power to the civilian-led government. The council also talks about justice for the Khartoum massacre, the creation of a new legislative council, and a few other political reforms. A civilian by the name of Abdullah Hamdok was named as the country's prime minister. This phase was marked by a relative calm, with many people waiting to see what would come of this new hybrid transitional government. However, surprise, surprise, the military reneged on their promise. On October 25th, 2021, El-Burhan and Hemeti conducted another coup. This time against the very transitional government that they negotiated into existence. They arrested the prime minister and other high-level civilian officials. They dissolved the Sovereignty Council and essentially took full control of the country. This coup proved to be a major turning point in the Sudanese Revolution. Street protests dramatically escalated, calling for an overthrow of the coup regime. I remember at the time following this very closely and seeing every couple of days, every week or so, a new call on Twitter for a millioniye, a million-person march. And if you see this footage, really, there was like this continuous, stubborn effort to constantly flood the streets, confront security forces, and constantly demand the overthrow of this new regime. And despite, or maybe in spite, of the many, many martyrs that were martyred in this period, the protesters refused to give in. Certain political maneuvers were happening behind the scenes, but it became abundantly clear after the coup that the military regime do not want to hand power, do not even want to share power, but want power for themselves and want to create a new dictatorship, one that the people, the revolutionaries in Sudan, refused outright. And at the same time, there were high-level disagreements between the two men who were de facto running the country. The main sticking point, the main source of conflict between these two men, was what to do with the RSF militia that Hemeti had been the head of. El-Burhan, who was functionally the head of the state, saw the need to incorporate this huge militia into the Sudanese army to monopolize the right of violence, which is the core principle of the state. For Hemeti, he saw nothing but losses if he was to lose command of these battalions of this militia. In short, he would lose his access to power. And so fast forward a lot of political drama over a year and a half to April 15, 2023, when Hemeti decided to wage war against the Sudanese state. And this is the war that is still playing out today. There's ample reason to describe the current war as a war between two generals. But many Sudanese reject the label, the categorization of civil war, because civilians have paid the heaviest price. Many describe the current war as a proxy war, because Hemeti specifically has been funded and supported very, very heavily by foreign states, most significantly the UAE, which smuggles weapons through Chad in the border that the RSF controls. And in return, a lot of vital resources, such as gold, is sent back to the UAE, which I believe is now one of the largest sellers and traders of gold, even though there is not a single gold mine in the UAE. For protesters and revolutionaries in Sudan, they have largely avoided siding with either the RSF or SAF. Both men, although now fighting each other, were fighting hand in hand just 5 minutes ago against the revolution, against the people of Sudan. Many organizers and activists in Sudan who were either not displaced or killed have been doing incredibly important work on the ground in the form of the emergency response rooms, which have literally been keeping millions of people in Sudan alive. But I'll talk a lot more about that a bit later. Those in the diaspora are working tirelessly to raise awareness, to fundraise, to send to these emergency response rooms, and the like. Essentially, this is where Sudan is now. But there is one aspect of this entire story that I have avoided talking about, only because I believe that it deserves its own section, and that is the neighborhood resistance committees. I've noticed that the resistance committees are often overlooked by outside commentators and analysts, but for those who know them, for those who really understand the Sudanese Revolution, they describe the resistance committees as the backbone of the revolution. So, what are they? In short, the resistance committees are grassroots neighborhood-level organizations of ordinary citizens who were organizing against the regime. Initially, they were more of almost like a tactic of protests, a way of getting people from across the country in all these different little neighborhoods in the different areas and regions to come out, to mobilize, and they would support protesters, not only mobilize them, by providing shields and masks, and oftentimes participating in the protests and standing in the forefronts. But soon, as the mode of organizing began to spread, the resistance committees moved away from simply being a tactic of protest, and greatly expanded both in scale and in scope. They would eventually become an independent political body with their very own political charter, which in great detail maps out their demands and desires and ideals for the future of the state of Sudan. The resistance committees, in line with the values of the December Revolution, would also practice mutual aid within their local neighborhoods. They would, for instance, provide food and cooking gas and other basic essentials for more vulnerable members of their communities. People who couldn't wait in bread lines, older people for example, would have bread brought to them by younger, more able-bodied people, members of the community. The committees would also hold space for discussions at a communal level and talk about the revolution, learn their history, learn about the situation, and the political machinations of the day. The history and development of the resistance committees was constantly fluctuating and changing based on new political situations in the country. For instance, as a result of the internet blackouts that the regime would constantly impose on the people, the resistance committees became increasingly important as a offline mode of reaching and communicating and disseminating information across people across the country. Another really important example of how the resistance committees would shift based on the political situation was that following the coup, which basically spelt the death knell of any of these attempts at creating a joint civilian-military government, the resistance committees became increasingly public and political and began advancing their very own ideas, essentially dismissing the kind of liberal establishment opposition tactics of the FFC, again, the Forces of Freedom and Change. At the start of the revolution, it was the FFC that would announce the dates for the protests, and it was the RCs that would mobilize the people. But by 2021, especially after the coup, it was the resistance committees themselves who announced the dates of the protests and mobilized the people. Also following the coup, the resistance committees started doing their own press releases and even opened up their own website, with one important feature being a list of martyrs of the October 25 coup with names, ages, and photos. A real attempt to humanize the very people who are gunned down on the streets, the martyrs of the revolution, who otherwise remain nameless and exist as numbers. Pretty soon, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of resistance committees across Sudan. But as the name suggests, we are talking about very small organizations that focus on neighborhood levels. So the next step for them, which they took, was coordinating and collaborating, which they did at a state level, and these organizations were called coordination committees. By 2022, all 18 states of Sudan had a coordination resistance committee. And in that year, the resistance committees announced a historic step: the creation of political charters that mapped out in great detail the ideals and demands of the revolution and for the future of Sudan. The process of the creation of these documents was incredibly democratic and participatory. The contents of these charters were developed at the grassroots level in these discussions at neighborhood levels by the resistance committees. They were drafted, developed, brought to the state level to the coordination committees, who then shared it with other coordination committees across the country, and brought back down for revision in, again, very participatory methods. And then, once a certain document was fully fleshed out, it was voted on, again at a local level, brought to a state level, and so then what you had is two differing documents that different resistance coordination committees had adopted for themselves. And by January 2023, a final unified document was agreed upon, voted on, and signed by all the representatives of all of the coordination committees in a large press conference that you're seeing right now. And here it is. The Revolutionary Charter for the Establishment of People's Power. Look at this. It's 52 pages long. Like, I don't know how to express this, but if anybody has ever worked on a Google Doc with 3-4 other people on just like a 5-10 page, I don't know, grant application, you'll know how difficult it is to collaborate on writing. Now imagine a 52 page revolutionary charter that maps out a completely new vision for a state and collaborated with not 500, not even 5,000, like tens of thousands of people read this, signed off on it, and were like, yes, this represents my desires, my vision for the country. That is what I'm holding in my hand right now, and it's honestly incredible. Like, I don't know. I don't know if I know any other example of something so thorough that has gone through such a process. But so, let me share with you a little bit about what's in this document. It can be broken up into basically 3 parts. The first is a 1-page preamble, and I'm going to read it in its entirety because I think it gives you a very good sense of what this document is and how revolutionary it is just as a document. The Revolutionary Charter for Establishing People's Power is a political document for initiating a deep-anchored holistic political process with the ultimate goal of formulating a political vision of national unity that digs deep into the very nature of the nation-state, governance, economy, and transfer of power. This political vision is grassroots-based and shall be formulated by the Sudanese people by means of public and open discussions, to be organized by the resistance committees, elected trade unions, and other revolutionary forces with genuine belief in the necessity of bringing about radical change, in line with the general vision of this charter. This charter is a culmination of decades-long relentless struggle and resistance of the Sudanese people, which has been going on since the Declaration of Independence in 1956. In the particular context of the December 2018 revolution, this charter is the cornerstone in the process of translating revolutionary action into a clear and coherent vision, as well as launching the process of handing over power to the people by stripping it away from the elitist political club, both traditional and modern, that has always served the proxy alliance of dependency, which only promotes greedy foreign interests against the interests of the vast majority of the Sudanese people. This charter represents the first step towards transcending the chronic Sudanese crisis, which ultimately plunged Sudan into a degenerate state, marked by civil conflicts, famines, and armies of mercenaries, a state completely stripped of its national sovereignty. In the context of the upcoming transitional period, sovereignty is to be defined as consolidating a democratic power practiced by the people at all levels and power structures, based on the constitutional legitimacy stipulated for in the transitional constitution that governs and shapes the transitional period. The task this document sets for itself couldn't be more ambitious, but going through it, it really doesn't fail. The second section of this document, which is about 15 pages long, is a revolutionary revision of the history of Sudan. It kind of reads like a people's history, and by that I mean it seems to be working against the official narrative, the official history of Sudan that was taught to them at school under the Bashir regime. And instead, it sets out a history that centers the people of Sudan and their struggle against colonialism, the nation-state, the military, and the economic elite. It's a people's history, written by the people, that centers the revolutionary ideals and aspirations of the revolutionary moment that they were in. And this is definitely no easy task, because Sudan is a very divided country. Or rather, I should say, that al-Bashir manipulated and intentionally divided the country, created these peripheries, set them against one another, in order to maintain his rule. And so, what you find in this document, what this sort of telling of history in a new way does, is it is also attempting to create a new Sudanese identity. An identity based on inclusivity, diversity, dignity, freedom, and justice. The core principles of the December Revolution. So, this section begins with this paragraph. The political conflict in Sudan could only be understood within the framework of an in-depth interpretation of the historical context of the formation of the Sudanese state throughout the colonial eras, Turco-Egyptian and Anglo-Egyptian colonial rule in Sudan, whose sole goal was aimed at appropriating and ravaging the national resources by means of engineering a neo-social fabric to be built on colonial terms, out of the pre-existing kingdoms and local states marked by ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity. This section isn't just descriptive, but also begins to lay out the core demands of the revolution. The political prospect of the December Revolution is about a radical transformation of the nature of the state itself, from a centralized elitist state into a development-oriented, civilian, and democratic people's state. The third part of this document, which is by far the longest, is a super detailed, super thorough, revolutionary roadmap for the country. So the first three things that are covered in this section are the demand for the complete overthrow of the coup regime, the forbidding of the military from entering politics, and a demand for justice for the crimes of the coup regime and the Bashir regime. Then, the rest of this section basically lays out a fully formed structure for a new government, for a new state. The first step of this would be the creation of what they call the Transitional Revolutionary Council, which would oversee the transition into a fully civilian-led, democratic Sudan. But it also gets super nitty-gritty. The creation of different commissions, the different levels of government, the economic policies of the new government, the foreign policies of the new government, just all these little details. Again, 52 pages. It's honestly a lot, and it's really hard to sum up. It's honestly less of a manifesto. It's more like a kind of new constitution, which is a bit weird to say because a big part of the document is the need to create a new constitution, but this is a pretty big first step. As far as I know, this isn't just the only such revolutionary document in recent memory. I think it might be the first one ever. I really can't think of another example, especially one of such scale and scope. This isn't a document created by some organization or some party. This was created by thousands upon thousands of ordinary people across Sudan, of nameless revolutionaries who dedicated themselves to this revolution, to imagining a future alternative to the current situation, both economically, politically, and socially. It's a document that centers justice as a necessary part for any revolutionary transition. justice for the crimes of the regime, but also a justice that addresses structural issues that creates these peripheries and these centers. I think it's quite obvious that I am constantly impressed at the very existence of this document, and reading through it is just so inspirational, and it's just mind-boggling that it even exists. But when, on April 15, 2023, Hemeti waged war against the Sudanese state, and fighting raged across the country, the focus on political work such as this all but halted. Many of the members of the resistance committees began engaging in humanitarian work and formed what is known as the emergency response rooms. These are grassroots organizations that are literally keeping millions of people alive, and they are largely supported by donations by the Sudanese diaspora. If you want to support people in Sudan monetarily through the situation, I highly recommend you look into these emergency response rooms and donate to them. I'll put links in the description below. But I said that the focus on this type of political work has all but halted, but it has not stopped entirely. To that end, on October the 10th, 2023, the resistance committees announced and released a statement. This one was 15 pages long, and it was titled The Political Vision to End the War. The document starts by stating clearly that the resistance committees are not taking a side in this conflict, that they support neither the RSF nor SAF. It then proceeds to lay out a very detailed analysis of the causes of the current war. I've read a number of accounts and analyses, and this is honestly by far one of the most detailed and nuanced. It then details what risks happening to communities in Sudan, to Sudan as a whole, if this war continues, which, again, this document was written almost 2 years ago. The final part of this document is their plan to end the war, which they set out in 18 points, which combines both demands and actionable points. It starts with the demand for the complete dissolution of the RSF militia, and for it to be categorized as a terrorist organization. Then a demand for all the heads of the Sudanese army who oversaw war crimes during this war. They then lay out their strategy, which essentially is to create a parallel government in line with the Revolutionary Charter, essentially to create the Transitional Revolutionary Council that they describe in the Charter. They would then advocate for the legitimacy of that government as the actual representative of the Sudanese people, and work through media and advocacy to stop people on the ground and internationally from aligning with either al-Burhan or Hemeti. It also calls for international protests of solidarity with Sudan, with this new parallel government, and against the war. Now, I haven't found any signs that that parallel government was ever formed, but I think that's kind of understandable. The war has been more devastating than I think anyone could have ever imagined. And so it makes sense that some of these steps and plans never really materialized. But still, again, the very existence of that document, of that statement, is a mark in itself. And so I won't talk too much about the war, because that would be an entire other video. There are, of course, a lot of other people, especially Sudanese people, who have been regularly updating about the current situation in Sudan. For instance, the Sudanese storyteller Sara al-Hassan, also known as BS on Blast, does daily updates on basically every social media platform there is, and she is an essential resource especially in the English language, but she is tireless in her meticulousness and diligence and is an essential resource for absolutely anybody who wants to stay informed, know how they can help and stand in solidarity, but also just understand what's happening on a day-to-day basis. I'll also put a few other social media accounts of Sudanese activists and commentators and analysts in the description below if you want to learn more and stay up to date, but also get really important analysis about the war situation in Sudan. But as for an end, I can't think of a more suitable way to end this video than by reading the last words in the last statement that the resistance committees released on how to end the war. The revolution is a people's revolution, and power is the power of a people. And the military to the barracks, and the Janjaweed is to be dissolved. Mercy, forgiveness, and glory to the martyrs. This video was created within the From the Periphery Media Collective, where we create media based on international solidarity. As I said in the beginning, we don't have any core funding, and are supported by our community of listeners, viewers, and readers. If you want to help me make more videos like this, please head over to our Patreon page and become a member for either $5, $10, or $20 a month. While you're there, check out the other projects we do, such as my podcast, Politically Depressed. Again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you on our Patreon.